Things feel pretty tense in Washington right now. We're well into the second week of this government shutdown. But the real story, it feels like, isn't just closed federal offices.
Yeah.
We're seeing something, well, politically and fiscally pretty unprecedented unfold. It's this executive action involving federal funding that seems, I don't know, less like standard cost saving and maybe a lot more like political targeting. So for you listening, we're going to do a deep dive into this White House decision. They're canceling or unilaterally withholding billions in federal funds. We need to get past those headlines and ask, what's the specific budgetary mechanism they're using here during this crisis? What's the official reason they're giving? And critically, what does the sort of geographical selectivity of these cuts tell us about the political game being played? Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. So the core facts really came out last Wednesday. Russ Vought, the director of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, he laid it out. The announcement detailed actions against nearly $8 billion in funding.
$8 billion. Okay.
And this money was mostly categorized as energy and infrastructure funding. Vought was explicit, saying it was tied to what the administration calls the left's climate agenda.
Mm. And what really makes this jump out, I think, what shifts it from just a budget fight to something else, is the geography, right? Yeah. Our sources are confirming this hits 16 states, and every single one of those states backed former Vice President Kamala Harris in 2024.
Every single one.
It's an incredibly precise map, isn't it? It maps perfectly onto political opposition.
Exactly. And, if we look beyond that $8 billion that's supposedly being eliminated, that's called rescission, technically the really huge numbers are in the funds being actively withheld, deferred.
Yeah. Right.
We're talking about a combined total over $18 billion tied up in specific, very visible infrastructure projects.
$18 billion withheld. Wow. Which projects are we talking about?
Well, the primary targets are massive ones. You've got New York City's 2nd Avenue subway extension, which has been delayed for ages anyway. And then there's the Gateway Tunnel project. That's the huge one, connecting New York and New Jersey, vital for the Northeast Corridor.
Okay, Gateway. That's a big deal.
It is. And what's fascinating here is the specific focus. They're stalling these multi-billion-dollar projects in places absolutely core to the Democratic base. I mean, these aren't just abstract line items. Gateway alone, that's essential commerce. Thousands of commuters rely on it. Holding that funding, that creates maximum political pressure.
Yeah, and that maximum pressure idea, that leads us straight to the administration's sort of dual rationale, doesn't it? Because on one hand, the messaging is super political, blatantly so.
Yeah, I mean, we heard former President Trump telling reporters just this Tuesday something like they could use this shutdown to get rid of a lot of things that we didn't want, and they'd be Democrat things.
Which, lines up perfectly with his whole campaign pledge to dismantle what he calls Democrat programs. So the political frame seems pretty clear.
Yeah.
Use the shutdown as cover to permanently axe things they don't like.
But you absolutely have to contrast that political transparency, let's call it, with the official line, the fiscal justification. That's coming from White House officials like Vice President J.D. Vance. He framed these cuts as necessary triage.
Triage.
Yeah, arguing, the administration is just forced to prioritize, to preserve essential services while funding has lapsed.
Okay.
And the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, she reinforced that.
Yeah.
So the OMB is just reassessing spending across agencies to handle the situation responsibly. So they're trying to stick to this idea that it's just unavoidable fiscal duty during a crisis.
Okay, wait, though. If the official story is triage and fiscal necessity, how does that track with targeting a massive $18 billion project like Gateway, which is already underway? Doesn't stalling major construction actually cost more money in the short term, or at least complicate things hugely? It doesn't feel like simple triage.
That is the absolute critical tension here. And this is where we really need to get into the weeds a bit, the technical mechanics, because that's what makes this whole move strategically, new. See, when the government shuts down, the executive branch, specifically OMB, gets a lot more temporary power. Why? Because Congress hasn't appropriated any funds. There's a vacuum.
Right. Congress dropped the ball on funding.
Exactly. And the action involves two types of cuts you mentioned. Rescission, which is elimination, and deferral, which is withholding. Now, rescissions normally need Congress to approve them.
Okay.
But deferrals, just withholding money that's already been obligated at the executive, can do that unilaterally for a time under something called the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, the ICA.
Ah, the ICA. So that's the key mechanism they're using.
Precisely. The ICA was actually created way back when to limit a president's power to just refuse to spend money Congress had already approved. That old practice was called impoundment.
Right. I remember hearing about that, Nixon era.
That's the context. But the act still allows OMB to propose rescissions. And crucially for us right now, it allows for short-term deferrals of spending, while OMB supposedly figures out if the money is still needed. The shutdown creates this massive gray area because there's no overall spending bill. So the administration seems to be using this crisis moment to classify these huge politically sensitive infrastructure funds as deferred.
Forcing Congress's hand.
Exactly. Forcing Congress to actively fight to get the money released if they want those projects like Gateway to continue. It shows a strategic willingness to use the shutdown, not just as a freeze, but as a tool to fundamentally reshape spending priorities without going through the normal legislative process.
Wow. Okay, so that level of political maneuvering, using this ICA loophole during a shutdown, it makes sense that the backlash from Democrats, especially those affected, was immediate and pretty fierce. They're definitely not seeing this as simple triage on Capitol Hill. No, I saw Representative George Latimer. He's from New York's Westchester County. He described the cuts very bluntly. Said it was, I'm quoting here, political revenge, clearly outlined by Trump time and again.
Strong words.
Yeah. And he argued that the president just sees the U.S. as blue and red, and blue states are enemies. I mean, that kind of statement really sets the stage for a long, bitter fight.
It really does. And, the critics' main argument about selectivity is pretty compelling when you just look at the map. If the administration was genuinely doing impartial fiscal triage, you'd expect to see similar belt-tightening, maybe funding holds, announced in states that backed the former president in 2024.
Logically, yes.
But big states like Florida or Texas, which also get huge amounts of federal money, they're nowhere on this list. The fact that the cuts are hitting only those 16 states that supported Harris, it lends massive weight to the charge that this is political targeting, pure and simple. And this raises a really important question about how moves like this affect compromise. I mean, budget talks on the Hill were already incredibly difficult. Leadership is scrambling to find any path to reopen the government and pass the actual appropriations bills.
Right, the shutdown itself needs resolving.
Exactly.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. You pointed out the timing and the context of these already difficult budget negotiations. This partisan approach, targeting these big, visible projects in key Democratic areas and swing districts, it feels like it could completely blow up those negotiations.
It absolutely risks it.
It seems like they're weaponizing the budget process itself. They're not really giving Democrats an incentive to compromise, are they? It's more like daring them to hold out and risk losing essential funding for their people permanently.
That's a very real interpretation. It's a high-stakes gamble.
And that kind of tactic, it usually just hardens divisions, makes people dig in their heels. It doesn't really help find common ground for a bipartisan deal to end the shutdown or fund the government long term.
No, it makes it much harder. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, using this gray area in the Impoundment Control Act during a shutdown, well, the implications go way beyond just this funding lapse. It sets a really potentially dangerous precedent, doesn't it? It suggests an administration can use a temporary lack of funding, a crisis situation, as a proactive way to push through its permanent budget goals, basically bypassing Congress and the whole appropriations process.
Right. It turns the shutdown from just a failure of the legislative branch.
And an active tool for the executive branch.
It fundamentally changes the power dynamic in these budget fights going forward. So the core insight for you listening is that this really isn't just your typical government shutdown story. It looks like the explicit public use of budgetary power enabled by a technical reading of the law during a crisis, specifically to target political opponents, all while claiming, the high ground of fiscal necessity. The legality seems to hinge on exploiting that deferral mechanism while Congress is essentially paralyzed. So considering those stated goals, fiscal need versus what looks like very targeted political choices, what does this all mean for the future? For bipartisan efforts on big things like infrastructure or climate spending? And maybe, what does it tell us about the real reach of executive power when Congress can't pass a budget? That's the crucial thought we'll leave you to mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us today.